If you're an Intelligence Fusion mailing list subscriber, you'll know that we've changed up the structure of what was formerly Insight Weekly. Instead of now releasing podcast episodes every week, we'll now be moving to every 2 weeks. We want to provide you with deeper insight, more comprehensive analysis on wider trends, evolving patterns, and unexplored themes across the globe. Future episodes are likely to be a little bit longer in length and therefore will need a little bit more research on our end. We'll still be providing a weekly email that'll give you a rundown of the global security landscape, highlighting key incidents and significant developments that have happened in the last 7 days. Just make sure you're subscribed to the Intelligence Fusion mailing list to receive it. I'll pop the link in the video description so you can sign up. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The Insight. I'm Laura Brown from Intelligence Fusion, and this week I'm joined by Max Taylor, Viraj Patni, and Vincent Fevrier, all senior regional analysts here at IF. And this week we're taking a closer look at insurgencies across the globe, what makes an insurgency successful, and in comparison, why some can fail. We'll also take a look at the activity, tactics, ideologies behind various insurgency groups from each region to better understand if these are the defining factors that can actually help them succeed. So first of all, starting us off this week, we are going over to Max, who's given us a definition of actually what an insurgency is.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I think before we can even move on to what makes them successful or not successful, it is important to define what they actually are, because it is quite a vague term. But generally, as a group, we understand it as non-state violent actors that are opposed to the recognised government. So as we just mentioned, this is very broad, but then the more specific the definition gets, the more contradictions there are and the more cases you find that just don't quite fit with the definition. So it's best to keep it as this. And it gets more complicated as well when you start to bring in attempted definitions of terrorism, because the term itself can't really be defined. And terrorism and insurgency are often very close, if not the same. So not all insurgent groups are terrorist groups. It depends who recognises them as terrorist groups. But generally, insurgencies differ from terrorism groups in that they're more localised and they're more restricted to a single country or perhaps two countries, whereas terrorism groups often have a more international aspect to them. But again, this is quite vague and it's not always the case. There are some insurgencies that are international groups. So it's best not to go into too much detail here, but a vague definition such as non-state actors seems to be our best approach, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely, when looking at terrorism versus insurgency, I think insurgencies probably have a larger kind of political goal or political, and we see that often with these insurgent groups having political wings and taking political activities to try to establish their goal further along.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. So you've got groups like the New People's Army in the Philippines who are a militant wing of a political organisation. So yeah, that's quite a common theme.
Yeah, I think like in the history, so you said the NPA in the Philippines, and I think came out kind of as the armed wing of the Communist Party, and I think we've seen that as well in Latin America with several groups coming out, kind of the FARC or ELN kind of, or EPL in Colombia kind of coming out from Communist Party and that ideology, and then becoming kind of taking up arms to push their goal, but then kind of splitting off and trying their own political, establishing their own political parties or taking matters into their own hands rather than sticking to the political party side.
Yeah, I agree with that, yeah. So I think in defining what actually makes them successful, I've put together 6 factors which I found generally tend to be the recurring themes among insurgencies. I think it's really important not to try and lump all insurgencies in as one and treat them all as the same. Each one has nuanced differences, as Vincent was just saying. There is parallels, but there's differences as well. So it's important to see them separately in their own right. But with that said, there are parallels. And I think I've noticed in my own work these following categories coming up. So first is domestic support, so support from the population, or at least just passive sympathy. It doesn't have to be active support, just some form of support. Foreign support, normally from foreign states, but it can also come from foreign non-state groups, whether it be financial support, weapons, or even logistics and personnel. Terrain and geography. So if there's remote highlands or forest and jungle areas which militants and insurgents can find cover in, then this generally helps. But again, every country is different, so the terrain varies. A weak central government, I think this is important because a strong central government can crack down on militant groups and before they gather the momentum they need to overthrow that government. whereas weak central governments struggle for legitimacy, and as a result, gives these insurgent groups an opening to start exploiting. I think a weak economic situation as well is really important. So the weaker the economy, I think the more likely people are to take up arms, and the more likely that people are going to support anti-government groups as people get tired with the government who they see as responsible for the weak economic situation. And lastly, and I think this one's more important as time goes on and technology improves, is information dissemination. So how well a group disseminates its narrative to the people of that country and even international audiences. And I think perhaps this isn't as important as other ones such as domestic and foreign support, but no doubt this sixth and final one, information dissemination, I do think is a really important part of a modern insurgency.
Yeah, well, I think we should probably look at some of these more specifically with examples from groups. But I think so you talked about kind of domestic support, and I think there can be the benevolent support of the populace because those insurgent groups provide social benefits, provide things that the government can't provide or hasn't provided. But then we can also see that insurgent groups often commit terror attacks, and so as a means to kind of force populist support from the population by scaring them in a way using fear. So I think there's kind of two different strands to that support, and I think different groups undertake different means to gain that support. I think we see it to varying degrees in different countries as well.
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, there are internal and external factors that contribute to whether insurgencies are more effective or more successful. I think we can look at, in terms of internal factors, we can look at support and structure. So during the Cold War, you had insurgent groups that relied on the support of either the Soviet Union or the US, and I think now overt military action is something that's more likely to so garner a stronger international, maybe military response. So that's less likely now. I think today non-state groups have developed networks of mutual support, including links to organized crime, and they've also taken up more decentralized structures. So this type of structure is much more resilient than centralized structures, and much more harder to defeat. It makes internal groups much more harder to defeat. I think the larger, more established organizations, they have different categories of personnel as well. So you have the logistics side, you have the intelligence, you have combat, you have counterintelligence as well. So when you look at groups such as Al-Shabaab, you have the intelligence unit within Al-Shabaab that plays a key role in its success. What about leadership? Do you think that's a key factor for its success?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good question because certain groups vary, as we've already mentioned. But what you were saying about a decentralized leadership, I think is really key because especially now with US drone programs targeting leaders quite frequently in various countries, it's important to be able to adapt and survive without certain members of your key leadership. So I've seen with other groups, takes me to the first example, actually, the Afghan Taliban. They're a really interesting group because they have got a centralized leadership in the form of a central shura. And these people have been involved in the peace talks going on with the US government. But at the same time, the Taliban's also at times quite a decentralized movement. So whilst this leadership is carrying out these talks with the US government and the Afghan government, meanwhile in Afghanistan, you've got multiple local level commanders who have their quite large have their own agency to do what they want to an extent. And they operate relatively freely. So they adhere to the broader protocols set forward by the main leadership, but at the same time, they're not reliant on it. So they have got, as you said, mutual networks. They have got their own mutual networks of whether it be criminal groups or other militants or whatever it may be. So it's often said in the news that the Taliban are quite heavily related to the drugs trade. And a lot of people will often try and say that the Taliban are the drugs trade, which isn't strictly true. In some cases it is, in some cases it isn't. In some places, the Taliban simply works with local drugs traders or extorts money from drugs traders and allows them to operate in their territory. It's a very complicated relationship, which I don't want to go into too much detail. But yeah, so this decentralized leadership where people are, to an extent, these Taliban commanders at a local level are self-sufficient has been really important in what's made the Taliban so resilient.
So I think talking about kind of the decentralized structures, the ELN's got similar structure in terms of they have kind of a core core group of leadership, which handles mostly the political aspects. So whether there's a peace negotiation with the government, which took place initially in Ecuador, but then got moved to Cuba and then completely kind of put off early 2019 after they committed a vehicle bombing in Bogota. But like you said, with the Taliban having kind of different fronts, I suppose, with different leadership, with different goals. It's the same thing in Colombia. These fronts of the ELN kind of take part in the criminal economy, whether it be drug trafficking, whether it be illegal mining, or other means, to kind of fund themselves. And they kind of have, like you said, that agency to kind of take decisions on their own for their economy, on how to benefit themselves, or even military action. But I think we do see, without the strong hierarchy, some weaknesses in that horizontal structure, just because in Colombia at least, I've seen there's several fronts, whether it be VLN or FARC dissidents, which were remnants of the FARC group that demobilized in 2016, who are now infighting and fighting each other for control of the territory, control of the criminal economy, drug-producing lands, drug labs, and things of that nature. So in a way, because these groups have moved kind of away, they still kind of guided by ideology, but now it seems that they're more focused on the criminal economy. They're just, it's led to more infighting between each other. So in a way, weakening kind of the overall group in a way. But yes, I wonder if you've seen that within kind of infighting within specific groups or anything like that, with insurgencies within your group.
Yeah, I find it particularly common actually. So within the Taliban, it's again, it's quite complicated. They're a complicated country, complicated group. But within the Taliban, you've got a splinter faction, which is headed by a man called Mullah Rasul, and he's claims to be a different part of the Taliban, but essentially they are two different factions, and they're in frequent clashes. And you see it with the Houthi rebels as well. Yemeni media often reports quite minor clashes, but again, they're really related to the ideology. As you said, it's more often about practical issues on the ground, whether that be a tribal dispute or simply something along the lines of taxation of drugs traders at a market or something along those lines. So, yeah, these clashes do occur, but generally, I find groups such as the Houthis and the Afghan Taliban have been able to weather the storm here, and still maintain some form of cohesion. But I think we've spoken a bit about successful insurgencies. It'd be quite interesting to speak about what makes insurgencies fail, or at least what causes them to be less successful. Because it's hard to, I find with insurgencies, it's hard to determine them as entirely unsuccessful. Because simply, if an insurgency exists, it's experiencing some form of a success to an extent. Because its mere existence means that the government's failed. So its mere existence is therefore, to an extent, a victory. But so it's easier to, I think, with insurgencies to measure how successful they were. So I did a bit of looking back in history, and one historical case of an insurgency that is generally considered to have failed is the Malayan Insurgency. So if we go through these 6 factors we mentioned earlier, so the Malayan Insurgency, which was between 1948 and 1960, it lacked domestic support because it was a communist insurgency in a country where communism simply hadn't attracted a lot of support. It had some foreign support from China, but not much, and they were facing the British government at the time in a Cold War era. So it was a polarized world. So a lot of people were reluctant to face the British backed by the Americans. They actually had, this is an interesting one. They actually had quite good terrain. They hid out in jungle areas, but the British forces and the Malaysian forces were able to, in some ways, take this advantage away from them, because this was a period before media was widespread. So they used a lot of measures to limit their access to the terrain that just simply wouldn't be acceptable these days. A weak central government, again, the Malayan government at the time was fairly strong, and the economic situation was also fairly strong because the rubber trade from Malaya was quite strong because of the Korean War. So there's a high demand for rubber. And information dissemination, the communist insurgents in Malaya did very poorly. So of these 6 factors, they achieved some, so there was some success. And the fact that they existed is also, again, as we said, means that it wasn't a total failure. And it's also important to look at the dates that this insurgency took place between 1948 and 1960. That's quite a long insurgency. This wasn't a short conflict. So to say that they were a complete failure seems a little premature, but I do think they didn't quite have the success as a groups that we've mentioned already.
Yeah, and I think from my end, I looked at a few, but it's like you said, it's hard to define, I guess, a failing insurgency versus a successful one, because I think the threshold for success is different depending on the group, depending on the region. But I guess one example might be the Brigade 2506, which were a group of Cuban exiles, which were trained by the CIA, and which their goal was to overthrow the Fidel Castro regime in Cuba. And they were the group that took part in the Bay of Pigs invasion, where we saw several hundreds die as well, but mostly the group was captured and then exchanged back to the US in exchange for food and medicine. So I guess that would be the closest I could find to a failure, in that it ultimately achieved its goal. But I think you made the point that early on, kind of they were backed by conventional forces and things like that. So could that actually be considered an insurgency or not? But I think the overall goal is similar to what we see to modern day and common insurgency groups.
I agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. So I think, in terms of external factors, they can also sort of contribute to, again, whether insurgencies are more successful or unsuccessful. I think with terrain, like you mentioned, I think it's an important consideration, both the type and the size of the terrain in which the groups operate. I think the understanding, if the group has a good understanding or familiarity with the terrain in which they operate, I think this I think this is important. If they do, it's they're much more likely to succeed in their actions. So in Africa, you have insurgent groups that have established bases in forested areas. These are rugged areas that are difficult to access and to control by government security forces. I think large areas are also difficult to control by the government, and there's the added challenge of securing territory, including villages, which are often in remote areas. I think another important thing is government action. I think insurgent groups, they benefit from weak governments with limited capabilities and capacities. I think what they need to do, what militaries need to do more is what they have to ensure that they do is not just focus on the military aspect of it, but also the civic action. So the application, for example, of basic service delivery and actions taken to address any long-standing grievances to reduce the support base for insurgent groups. I think if governments do this, then they will sort of weaken insurgent groups. Or, I mean, ideally you do this to prevent insurgencies from taking place. But if you look at Mozambique, for example, there have been long-standing grievances around economic development in Cabo Delgado and social and political exclusion, which has stretched back decades. And I think this is also in a region which is the poorest in Mozambique. And I think more recently there have been frustration among youth in the region with unemployment within the extractive industry. So, I mean, essentially it's about winning hearts and minds, for the long term and not just the short term. Otherwise, insurgent groups will exploit this. I think another factor that has sort of helped the cause of insurgent groups in Africa, if you look at the Sahel, there have been hundreds of civilians have been killed so far this year in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger by security forces, that have accused these people of colluding with these insurgents, jihadist insurgents. I think this is also now a growing problem in Mozambique as well. So I think, this is something that governments needs to take into consideration. Otherwise, I think it helps the cause of insurgent groups.
I think you brought up a really good point there, actually, is the role of the counterinsurgents and the military-civilian balance within a counterinsurgency. And I think that's actually a really good point, because one of the reasons actually is in the Malayan insurgency failed was the counterinsurgents, and the British were known for seeing a lot of the insurgency as a police problem rather than a military problem, which allowed them to take a slightly different approach. And again, it wasn't perfect, but it was the start of what became a general theme among counterinsurgents, is to start trying to incorporate things such as social development. Because at the end of the day, an insurgency, whilst yes, is a violent conflict, it is also it's a violent manifestation of an idea. And in Afghanistan, for example, that idea is the idea which underlies the Taliban, and you can't really shoot an idea. So that's where things such as social development, policing, and a strong central government is so important. So we've listed these 6, what makes this insurgency successful. But at the end of the day, if the ideology resonates with the people of that country and the government's doing very little to address the underlying reasons that is resonating with their population, then really the insurgency doesn't have to do very much. They just have to let the government lose rather than that the insurgency has to try and win. So I think without social development, you're only ever going to have short-term fixes. And I think that's something that militaries, especially in the 21st century, have really found to be a difficult problem. Because countries such as the USA, where you've got 4-year terms, strategy is very much built in 4-year bounds. So, for example, presidents are very reluctant to introduce a strategy that the benefits of which they won't see in 4 years' time. And normally, social development takes a lot more than 4 years to actually see any positive gains.
I think, like you said, so social development, government needs to undertake that to try to counter the insurgency. But I think that's also linked to, say, territories. So a lot of these insurgent groups operate in rural areas, forested areas, jungle areas. So in Colombia, a lot of these groups have control of large swaths of territory, whether it's the southwest or the northeast areas where there's also oil and gas. And so companies that operate in that area are often targeted by these insurgent groups, whether it be extortion, whether it be pipeline being blown up. So I think the insurgents can also often target these social development programs as a means to kind of push back the government and bring back the populace to a certain level of discomfort to where they then come back towards insurgents for benefits and social development on that end. So I think you mentioned the NPA earlier in the podcast. So they've also, from looking at them, they've also targeted construction projects or development projects within their areas of control. Because that's where these groups kind of get the main support is from the poorer sectors of the population in more rural areas. So the more delay they can put on those social development projects, the best for them in terms of achieving their goals.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think to wrap it up, then I guess the 6 points we labelled at the start: domestic support, foreign support, terrain, central government, economy, and information, I think have generally held firm. And when we look for parallels within what makes these groups strong, so you were saying the NPA, their control of the economic situation, for example. And I think, as we said at the start, all these groups that we've mentioned in this chat have been very different, and they all have to be observed with very unique and nuanced analysis of each one. But it is interesting how we've seen these same 6 factors do seem to be a recurring theme as among the ones which make it successful.
I think so. I know from those points and things like that, like what course of action do you think the current groups that are currently operating in your region, whether it be Africa or more Middle East or Asia, do you think, what does the future hold for them? Do you think, are they going to still have the ability to continue the fight, or are there some groups that you think are weakening and aren't going to be able to be sustained in the long run? So I think from my region, we got the ELN in Colombia, and their insurgency has gained strength over the last few years because the FARC, which was the largest group at the time, demobilized in 2016, and the ELN kind of took over control of a lot of the territory that the FARC used to have, which was drug-producing land. So the ELN is making off quite nicely, I guess, with territory, with the ability to make money off drugs, off illegal mining. And yes, they're still fighting the government, they're fighting right-wing paramilitaries, but they're also have the ability to operate within Venezuela, the neighboring country on the border area, because Venezuelan government's not really talking with the Colombian government, so there's no, and they've been known to support kind of left-wing guerrillas who've operated in Colombia. So I think in terms of ELN, yes, there was talks there was peace talks in 2018, 2019, that kind of broke off, and I don't see them kind of restarting, at least in the near term. But I think there's other groups, so like the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path in Peru, they've dropped in influence significantly since kind of the mid-90s in their area of control. has shrunk to kind of just a single kind of area in Peru, in central Peru, the VRAEM region. And they've kind of become kind of like most guerrilla groups in Latin America, less ideology, but more kind of as a drug trafficking group. And I think if Peru has the military capacity and the government capacity to kind of implement those social projects, those economic projects, there could be a shot at kind of very weakening the group even further, if not eradicating it. And then there's smaller groups within Paraguay, with the EPP, which continue actions but are still quite small and could be eradicated with the right measures. But yeah, I was wondering if, based on the insurgent groups within your region, kind of how do you see the near future be for those groups, and do they provide specific threats to businesses or anything like that within your region in the near term?
So if I had to pick one that I think has done particularly well, and I think its future looks quite strong as an insurgent movement, I would say the Taliban seem to have achieved quite a lot in the previous years of fighting. So since the US and allied intervention, the Taliban have very much weathered the storm, and there were times when they really struggled, and then they've made quite a significant resurgence now, to the extent that they've actually engaged in diplomatic talks with the US government and the Afghan government. So I'd say they've achieved relatively quite a lot of success there. And I say on the other end of the spectrum, the Syrian Rebels, I think, represent a really interesting insurgent group that perhaps has been, I wouldn't say unsuccessful. The war's been quite prolonged, and they still exist with quite some strength today. But the Syrian Rebels is a series of multiple different rebel groups, and the rebel-held pocket in the Idlib province region now is seen infighting between these groups, so between Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the Al-Qaeda-affiliated Hurras al-Din. So there's been infighting, like we mentioned earlier. We spoke about the damages of infighting, and as a result, the Syrian rebels have generally seen their territory shrink. And I think they're starting to lack reliable foreign support. So they're not quite ticking all the boxes that we've seen that make successful insurgent movements. So I think you've got the Taliban perhaps more successful, and the Syrian rebels are looking not unsuccessful but less successful, I would say.
So we have seen a spread of fighting. So geographically, the geographical expansion of fighting in the Sahel region, for example. So we had recent attacks in northern Ivory Coast, which is, I think, the first time since 2016, for example. And then I think there are concerns that I think the UN are saying that there are concerns that Burkina Faso could be the next Iraq or Syria. And then in Mali as well, we've had more attacks in the west of the country. So I think this also, together with things like climate change, which impact livelihoods, I think these kind of things, they bring further challenges to the government. And in Mozambique too, this is a group that seems to be growing stronger as well. And on top of that, they have foreign fighters as well. So we could see an expansion into maybe southern Tanzania, for example, and south towards the regional capital of Pemba. So yeah, I'd say it's a growing concern. I think these insurgent groups will remain for the coming years.
And so from a business perspective, I know that you, Vincent, mentioned, attacks on pipelines and things like that. In your regions and with these groups, are there any other particular kind of sectors or actual businesses that are affected by their activity?
I think it's a good question. At a general level, across all insurgencies, obviously an insurgency brings insecurity, so that has obvious implications on business in any country. But I think each insurgency has a different impact on business. So Vincent's mentioned pipelines, and certain insurgencies targeting businesses in that way, whereas another insurgency might try and support pipelines. So, for example, the Taliban have actually tried to support the Tapi pipeline, which is a pipeline running to Afghanistan. So there's some business. So each insurgency has different impacts on business. So I find a common theme is a lot of businesses have to, whilst secretly, they have to actually negotiate with local militant groups, especially if they have a lot of territorial control. But they can't be seen to be publicly doing that, because that seems undermining the government. So a lot of times a very complicated relationship between business and insurgents, because sometimes they're targeted and sometimes they're supported.
So I think the sectors that have been most affected are oil and gas in Mozambique. But you have the extractive industries in Burkina Faso, mining companies, but also NGOs. I think they've had to change the ways that they operate. So less road transport because of ambushes, the risk of ambushes. Also, we had NGO workers kidnapped a few weeks ago in Niger as well. So kidnap for ransom remains a concern.
Yeah, and I think regarding my region, so yeah, I did mention so the ELN targeting oil and gas pipelines, particularly in the departments of Nariño, Aroca, and Norte de Santander in Colombia. But they've also kidnapped oil workers, and just the threat to logistics companies in regards to roadside IEDs, threats to telecom sector because of there's been several attacks on cell phone towers or telephone poles or things of that nature, so public infrastructure, which then could put at risk employees that are going to repair that infrastructure. And then if we consider the Mapuche kind of militants in Chile as an insurgency, and that group is asking for jurisdictional autonomy, return of ancestral lands, and kind of support around their cultural identity. So if we consider that as an insurgency, they often target forestry companies with just arson attacks on their vehicles, as well as kind of energy projects by protesting or anything like that. So there's quite a variety of sectors that can be affected. And I think, like Max said, all these insurgencies bring insecurity in that areas. And a lot of these companies, especially mineral extraction or oil and gas, kind of are often in remote places where these insurgencies control a lot of territory and yield a lot of influence. So like Max said, could also be extortion of these companies that work in that sector. So it's always a concern for businesses.
Absolutely. And I think, like you've all kind of said, it goes without saying that these insurgencies can bring significant kind of threats to businesses, regardless of the region. But yeah, thank you very much, team, for this week's insight. And thank you very much for our listeners for tuning in. We love your feedback on the new structure, so please leave us a comment. Let us know what you thought about the episode. If you enjoyed it as well, please like and share it with your network. And if you're not yet subscribed, don't forget to hit the subscribe button before you go. Thanks very much and see you next time.